So, Andy, I'd love to know how it is that you came to make your home in Ojai.
Great question. Both my parents' families are from here. And I grew up on Fulton Street on North Fulton. And on my mother's side, there's 14 kids. My mom's the second oldest.
Wow.
And the youngest is only about a year and a half older than me. So I had lots of family here, and it was great. And so on my dad's side too, they grew up in Ojai as well, but they moved out of Ojai, the family. So my sister and I my dad's career was in Los Angeles when I was born. So we were coming here, it felt like every weekend, going to the rec center for the summers and all that. And then in 4th grade, we moved here. So I started Topa Topa in 4th grade. But we were here all the time anyway. So from 4th grade on, I've been here.
You're effectively a lifer.
Yep, pretty much, yeah. And then even when I lived in Ventura, I worked here. So I've been here the whole time. So
cool.
What you're gonna see on some of the material that I'll be publishing later is, like, I got my first marriage, I got married at Camp Comfort, second one at Taft Gardens, stuff like that. I mean, it's like
that.
Total Ojai scene. And
yes.
Even stories like, one of our favorite things to do was climb the arcade and lay on top of the arcade. I know, and like watch the meteor showers, and so I have all these Ojai stories. So yeah, I love it here.
So we're going to talk about the Agora Foundation, but first I would love to know why you feel motivated to do the work that you do.
Yeah, great question. Well, I'll tell this little story because this didn't happen right away in a way that I understood it, but what happened was I was at Soul Park and I was looking across the creek at the golf course over there. And if you look at the creek and you see the creek sides, there's trees growing, you know, in the grass over there on the golf course, but you can see their roots in the creek. And I had been just interested in learning for a long time, and even when I went to art school for undergrad, I was very interested in philosophy and just kind of how everything came to be the way it is. And it hit me when I was looking at that creek, that culture, the culture that we have, it gets handed to us, but it veils everything that went into it. It veils all the work that went into it. So if you think of the periodic table as an example, you think, wow, it's so organized. Like the universe just presents itself in this kind of perfect form. And you don't realize somebody, Mendeleev and others, figured it all out. They burned themselves, hurt themselves, made mistakes, exactly. So I became really interested in trying to understand not just sort of the history of how did we get where we are today, but more like, or in addition, how is it that we understand the fundamentals that in a way we accept things as a given, or we don't go back to those original pieces. Easy example would be like the foundations of our country.
Yeah.
So by reading all that stuff and the Federalist Papers and everything, the Articles of Confederation and Association, and you see all the work that these people did, and you realize, wow, America really is something brand new. The world's never seen it before. Now, of course, we don't always live up to our ideals. That's a different subject. But so anyway, what launched into what was to become the Agora Foundation was a bunch of us being interested in that reading. So it's literature, philosophy, theology, science, political science, history, to get where we get to our place today. And so it feels pretty magical, really. And this might sound silly, but every time I come to a new question or a new decision, I feel like I have a whole team behind me. And the whole team is a bookshelf.
That's amazing.
Of thousands of years. And of course you can't remember all of it, but there's a lot I do remember, and there's some that really do stick out. And I think, oh yeah, like what would Aristotle do here? Or, like what would Einstein do? Or even somebody like, I don't know if you know Hannah Arendt, but what would Hannah Arendt think of this kind of advertising right now? Something like that. And I go, oh yeah, that's really fascinating. Anyway, those are all the people that I would think of. But I just mentioned Western people, but in the East too, I became really interested in the Tao Te Ching and the Bhagavad Gita. Those are things we also read, and I realized, oh, the whole world is it's telling a story. And by doing this work, you get to be a part of the story. You're listening to the story, but then as somebody who's creative, like you and I both strive to be, you're also telling the story. You're contributing to the story. So that's what motivates me
That's
to be
beautiful.
in Agora. Thanks, yeah.
And I'll ask you more about
Sure.
books
Yeah.
in a bit, but let's talk about the Agora Foundation.
Yeah.
I'd love to know how it began and how it's evolved.
You bet, thank you. So it started, I was actually in graduate school when it started, and it got started by this company, BST, that I worked for a long time, Tom Krause, who's the founder. He and Paul O'Reilly and Mike McLean of Thomas Aquinas College
Okay.
got together and said, let's start having great book seminars for people who are interested, who don't want to commit to going back to school. And it was called Great Book Seminars in Ojai, and it started in September of 1998.
Nice.
25 years ago.
Oh my God.
Yep. And so I missed the first one because I was coming back from graduate school. But once I found out about it, and where I went to graduate school is St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is a great books program. And I won't lose my train of thought, but a great books program essentially means everybody takes the same thing. There's no special degrees. Everybody does the same curriculum. And typically you're doing it chronologically more or less in time, but you read all the greatest books of the West is what those schools do. So anyway, I missed the first one, but when the second one came and I was back in Ojai, they asked me would I like to run it. And I said, well, yes, I'm going to attend every single one too. So we were doing a seminar about every 6 weeks at the Ojai Valley Inn. And it was, really nice and everything, but then we realized, well, the price is kind of high to make it be there and all that sort of stuff. So let's make the price be lower, have it at different locations, have a sliding scale. And I should talk a little bit about how the method works. So there is a seminar leader. This is the way the college works and all great books programs. The seminar leader they don't lecture about what the work means. They simply facilitate a conversation by asking questions. And what we say is the teacher in the room is the author.
Okay.
And our main job is to try to understand what the author's saying before we decide if we agree with them or that they're right or wrong. So that takes some discipline. So you're reading somebody like Sigmund Freud, okay, and you think, well, we have a long history after Sigmund Freud of some things that are provocative, some things that have been discredited, et cetera.
Right.
But you read a book by him and you think, okay, all I'm trying to do first is what is he saying? And it turns out that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And even when I was in college, but most people's experiences when they first come to Agora, they realize, wow, I don't actually know how to read. Because you read things sort of fast, and you think, well, I know what this is.
Yeah.
I kind of get this. And you say it back, but if you really stop and you say, and this is what they're called tutors, the seminar leaders, but the tutor is so great at, they'll ask a question. And the question might be kind of, you think seemingly kind of superficial. You think, why did they ask that question? And you start digging into it and you realize, whoa, this is the heart of the work. And by circling around this question, you get to it. And I'll use an easy example. In the Iliad by Homer, it starts off, "O Muse, sing of the wrath of Achilles." And you think, okay. And a really easy question would be, or a very common question rather, is, why is Achilles mad? You say, okay, well, why is Achilles mad? And I'm not going to get into that work, but you think, well, he's actually mad for a lot of different reasons that launch you into the work, into honor, into that society. And so we dig into the work, trying to understand what the author's saying, and we limit the conversation to the work that we have in common, and that's all.
The work that we have in common.
In other words, if I said to you, we're going to read The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, for example, that's our seminar. We don't bring in Russian literature that you have also read on the side. You might be a Russian scholar or a Russian historian.
Right.
And while a little bit of that is helpful, mostly it stops the conversation because we don't know how to respond to you because you're the expert, we're not, so there's nothing to say.
Right.
And so what the seminar leader would gently do is they'd say, oh, that's very interesting, Andra, and then they would pull it back. Or if you said, well, my grandfather says X, Y, and Z, they would say, what in the text suggests that to you? And you would go there and people write notes in their books, they dog your pages, they highlight or use a pencil, and they go, oh yeah, like on page 72 when blah, blah, blah. So it's very in the text, sort of in the weeds in that sense, to get to some of those big ideas. And so back to the question, in 1998, we were doing one about every 6 weeks, and we had teachers coming pretty regularly, and we were kind of letting them come for free because we wanted them to be there. And a typical room size is 8 to 12 is sort of ideal, so everybody can speak. And the seminars are usually 2 hours at a time. So anyway, the teachers came to us and said, if you guys become an official nonprofit, we can get grants and have teachers come for free or hire you to go be at our school. So we're like, okay,
awesome.
Makes perfect sense, let's do it. So we incorporated, and in 2006 changed the name to the Agora Foundation. And so then it sort of launched officially. So we had 8 years of doing these seminars and getting some traction there. So since 2006, the seminars increased, but in general that's been our mode, adding us going to schools, working with either a class or a whole school, so we do that too. And the addition, we'll get to COVID in a second. In 2013, so we've been doing these seminars for a long time now, and we have a group of advisors, a bunch of great Ojai people at the time, and now we have people around the country, but they asked this question. They said, we were just in a seminar and we were talking about Thomas Aquinas's 5 proofs for the existence of God. Okay. So Thomas has these 5 proofs. Now you could decide if they're convincing or not, but we were reading these 5 proofs, and there's believers in the room and non-believers, and there's a Hindu, and all of the above. And this lady, she's so great, she just said, how is it that we can talk about Thomas's 5 proofs with a mixed group civilly, and we can't talk about GMOs without people getting rabid?
Right.
Okay. So then we thought, oh wow, she's onto something there. And it turned it to be what we call the Ojai Chautauqua, and that was Esther Wachtel's idea.
Oh, okay.
So Esther had this idea of the Chautauqua, and we said, great, let's do it. And we were kind of working with the Libby Bowl Foundation, trying to, when the bowl got rebuilt, first there was the foundation, so I was helping them out also. And we said, let's start doing these Chautauquas. And it was the same idea, which is take an idea like fracking. And we say, okay, well, what would be ideal? You have an oil person, an environmentalist, a geologist, a politician, that kind of, like the whole gamut. And you have a moderated conversation with as many facts as we can get. So producing a data packet of facts. And if there's competing facts, put them both in.
Yep.
And that's been our idea. So the Chautauqua really started from the civility that we have in the seminars. And so anyway, the Agora started, just putting these Chautauquas together and all that. So the thing that happened with COVID that was so interesting and unexpected was we had a seminar planned for March of 2020 on site in this very room. And then, oh gosh, we can't do it now. Everything's closed. And so we said, well, everybody seems to be using Zoom now, so let's use Zoom. And we realized people from all over the country had been wanting to come but couldn't.
Okay.
Yep. And so then we said, well, let's start doing online seminars. And the number of seminars we did completely jumped.
Wow.
So where we used to, in 2018, Agora became my full-time job. I had been doing it on the side for all the years up to that point. So the number of seminars went from like 18 to like 50 in 2018. But then when COVID came and we were doing them online, now we do about 250 events a year. Yeah, so we do roughly 5 to 7 a week seminars. They're only 2 hours or an hour and a half. So a typical week would be like I'll use this week or last week as an example. Tuesday night going through Middlemarch by George Eliot with the same group over 16 weeks, and then the Book of Exodus with the same group over 12 on Wednesday nights. Finnegan's Wake with a group on Wednesday afternoons, and then on the weekends typically we would have 2. So this weekend we're reading sections from the New Testament, but also Darwin's Descent of Man on Sunday.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's such wow.
Yeah, and so 2 different groups.
Yeah.
But yeah, so every weekend typically there's one on a Saturday or a Sunday. So COVID launched that, so while we will go back on site again and have already begun to do that, we will keep the online as is.
That's a positive thing that came out of COVID.
Yep.
Okay, so you mentioned some really interesting pieces of curriculum, and I'd love to know how you choose what the readings are going to be.
Britannica and the University of Chicago working together came up with this a collection of texts that was supposed to be an accompaniment to the encyclopedia that Britannica puts out. So the encyclopedia would be a collection of facts,
Yeah.
and then the great book series would be a collection of wisdom
Yeah.
or cultural tradition or
Must
something like that.
read for societal reasons.
Must reads. So they came up with a whole collection of books, starting with Homer, right, and going to mostly the end of the 19th century. That was the first edition. The next edition went into the 20th century and all that. So they came up with a collection. I have it, and it's excellent. And they actually did something that was so fascinating for somebody like you. If you think of the Oxford English Dictionary, and they were trying to say, you know, where was this word first used, right? So imagine like a whole gymnasium of people reading through Chaucer and, you know, trying to find, oh, here's the first time I found the word.
Oh my gosh.
They did the same thing with ideas. And so they said, okay, well, let's say an idea like freedom. Mm-hmm. So if you look at, it's called the Syntopicon, so they came up with these 2 books, and there's, if I remember right, 102 subjects, and they have a very neutral few-page essay that they wrote saying, here's how the subject of freedom is written about.
Wow.
Not here's what you think, but here's how it's been written about. And then they go through the books and they say, here's what Plato says about it, here's the page numbers in the book, you would go find that piece in that book, Aristotle, going all the way to the moderns. So anyway, when we decide what are we going to read, we've got that model. Mm-hmm. We've got what St. John's and Thomas Aquinas College use, all of those great books. And essentially you can really make it easy and say a book that has been very influential, not only for its time, but maybe for a long time after or even to the present day. Mm-hmm. Now that could be something that has later been proven to be wrong. An easy example would be Ptolemy, and the book is called the Almagest. So Ptolemy goes into how the planets are revolving around the Earth.
Right.
Okay, and there's epicycles, and you measure all that and all that. But what we do at Agora, we get to go much farther. So we take those Western books that are tried and true that everybody knows, you know, Shakespeare, Aristotle, Aquinas, all that kind of stuff, leading up to people like Einstein and things like that. But we go farther in a few ways. One is we do all of what we call the Eastern classics. So that would be, as I mentioned earlier, the Tao Te Ching, Zhuangzi, Taoist, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, the Arabian Nights. So we read everything that also does the same thing in their cultures too. And so what you see though is perennial questions they're called that for a reason. They're everywhere and they're all the time. They're, what's the best way to have a life? Yep. Is there an afterlife? You know, how do you get over grief? What's the best kind of society to have? What's the best government, et cetera, et cetera? All those questions are the human condition. And so we benefit a lot from that. We take it to the next step in 2 ways. One is we can take authors like Gabriel Garcia Marquez or Toni Morrison, for example, and say, they are clearly going to be in the canon someday. Right. Even if they're not yet. Yeah. Clearly, obviously, they are. So we read all of those too. Mm-hmm. So in our series, we'll always have some of those things that are more modern. Mm-hmm. And then we also have what we call a contemporary issues series, and those are things that our board and our advisors might have just some special interests, like it could be cognitive bias. So there's a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman. We'll read pieces of that. We're reading the genes and intimate history to understand genetics. And so you read like, oh, here's Darwin and all that work that happens up to the modern time, but here's how they discovered DNA, how they understand that DNA is the mechanism. But then you see there's all this very interesting cultural stuff like, here's how eugenics came out of that, right? In America, in Germany, of course. And so leading up to the modern time now, that kind of work, in addition to the foundational work about what does it mean to be a human, what's the value of a human, et cetera, you could also look at then, well, what it means, what a human is now becoming, not just now, it continues to be an interesting question that people keep asking as science shows us more about what material can be. So then you realize, oh wow, like, let me use a good example. If someone's trying to say, are you only a body, or is there something about you that's not body, like a soul? Right. Okay, so you say, okay, well, is there a soul? And these are kinds of questions that all these thinkers ask about. And sometimes somebody might show you a picture of yourself when you were 6. And they say, well, is this a picture of you? And you're like, yeah, that's a picture of me. And they say, well, what is it that's here, that's still here in you now?
Right.
And you go, okay, well, one answer is the soul. Okay, and that would be worth talking about, of course. And then the answer from a book like The Genes and Intimate History would be your DNA.
Right.
And so you think, oh, the DNA, it could be modified over time, let's say, but like with epigenetics and so on. But let's just say in general, the structure is there. That's the thing that is the same materially, that is being made up of new matter as new cells come to be. Then you realize that's not something that Aristotle could have said or other physical scientists, but we can say it now. And every scientist I know is very humble, and they'll say, there is a lot we do not understand.
Yep.
And I'm one of them. So we could say, we know what the mechanisms are, we know that things are the case, we don't know why they're the case.
Right.
So that's very much our group is, well, let's know as much as we can, or learn as much as we can, or ask each other as much as we can about these kinds of things, and make very interesting, also moral questions, like especially with genetics on that same subject. What is the moral principles one would use to say in utero you could prevent a disease by genetic modification? Why would you not do that, for example, or do it?
Right.
Or if somebody wants to be taller, why not do that?
Right.
Or whatever, pick your trait. That's the questions we're facing now. And so anyway, so Agora gets to go into those areas too, and we do it cautiously, but we do it neutrally. So even when we read theology, we come to it as, you found this book on the beach, not with all the cultural baggage, not are you a believer or not, but just what does the book of Exodus have to say by itself, just in itself. And so all the religious texts from around the world, including like the Quran, we just say, what is the text saying by itself? Now that doesn't suit everybody.
Yeah.
But it suits us, and it suits people who are wanting to read it in a way that they can just learn as much as they can about it.
Let me just
go ahead.
ask you a question.
Yeah.
You obviously have done a lot of reading, and a lot of reading of religious and spiritual texts from around the world. What has surprised you?
Oh yeah, geez, that's a good question.
Specifically amongst, those spiritual texts.
Right. This is sort of akin to the question, what are some books that keep sticking out? So one person that keeps sticking out for me, I can name who those people are. One of them, though, is Joseph Campbell, As a Thinker, and Hero with a Thousand Faces is a great book, which we've done in Agora. So he feels, if I understand him right, he's very comfortable with some ambiguity about these things. So he would say, like, don't mix up sort of the message and the vehicle of the message. So that's a point that he makes a lot. Is you can get really lost in some details or some culturally specific things and miss sort of the most important part. And so that's become much easier for me over the years, where you can read something and say, like in the Old Testament or the Torah, however you want to describe it, there's a lot of things that are very difficult for a modern reader to read. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
Of course.
Very violent.
No, of course. And even, modern rabbinical scholars would say that too, and you say, well, like even in Exodus, all the Egyptians get killed, and the firstborn get killed as one of the plagues and all that, and you kind of go, well, that doesn't match our notion of justice.
Yeah.
But what I think what Agora helps me do by doing these readings is I really can park it, and I could say, well, I don't have to give it my judgment yet. I can really just kind of revolve around it and just try to think around it and see what can I get from it. And I can do the same thing with the Tao Te Ching. As an example, the Tao that which can be told isn't the Tao. Okay, you think, so I'm going to read something now about the Tao that can't be told. But how could I circle it? How could I walk along the outskirts of it and get some glimpses about what the Tao might be from the clues that are being offered? So I've become much more comfortable saying, I have no idea aspects of whatever that divine thing is, but I feel very comfortable with some, and I'm okay with the ambiguity and the mystery of it. So that's been surprising. I guess another thing is just for some people, they would say, if you look at our logo, it's the School of Athens by Raphael, and then right in the center of the school especially if you've been to St. Peter's, you've seen it. There's Plato and Aristotle, and Plato's pointing up, and Aristotle's going down like this, and Plato's saying the truth is sort of in heaven, you might say, and Aristotle's saying the truth's down here. And Aristotle's holding the book of the Ethics, one of the books that always has come back to me. But so the very quick shorthand people sometimes say in the West is Plato leads all the artists, all the artistic thinking, and Aristotle leads all the scientific thinking. That's too truncated, but Aristotle has a really interesting view of this kind of first cause. What the shorthand might be is God. So that is, if I don't want to do it right now, I mean I could, but if somebody says, do you believe in God? I say, will you indulge me and give me 10 minutes to explain it to you? And if they say yes, I'll say, okay, here's how it starts. And it starts with Aristotle. And it's that there's a first cause. Something has to cause itself.
Yes.
And that appeals to my reason, and there's more I can say, but I was surprised to be such a kind of admiring of Aristotle's thinking there. I guess. Yeah.
Okay, so I asked you about the curriculum. I know that Agora works with high schools, and I'd love to know more about that.
Great, yeah, no, thanks. So the biggest thing that started, again, the teachers got us to think about it. They said,
local teachers?
Ventura County, some LA County people. When we were doing them on site in the early days, we had half the room were people driving from LA up here, because it's pretty rare that you would say, oh, I'm going to read whatever. I'm going to read the Brothers Karamazov over a weekend with 12 people, with a tutor guiding the conversation. I'll just say as an aside, I'm a total fan of book clubs. What book clubs tend to do is, let's all get together. Maybe you've read the book, maybe you haven't, but there's wine and there's dessert, and it's just great fun.
Yes,
And it's totally great. Nothing against it. This isn't that.
Yes.
This is people who actually really want to do that work. Anyway, so the teachers were saying, well, what's so great is, let's say something like Romeo and Juliet. Most high school students read that at some point in their career. And so instead of having, and good teachers do this already, instead of the teacher lecturing, okay guys, here, let's read this part, here's how to think about it, here's what it means, is just asking questions. And if the teacher can have enough facility with the text, enough comfort in understanding some of these perennial questions, and then some practice guiding a group, they will ask a question, and then the students grapple with the question themselves. And so then the students then learn how to listen to other people, how to build on what other people are saying. And then the teacher or the facilitator can gently bring the group back, or if somebody is speaking too long, they could gently get other people to talk. That's just good group facilitation. But that takes a little practice. And then what we find, our teachers have told us this, and I've seen this myself so many times, is you leave there in that conversation with a real understanding of the text that you don't have if you get lectured to. And so then you can really sit with it and say, oh yeah, using Romeo and Juliet, you could say, yeah, I understand the infatuation of it and how that works. And then, but you can look at it differently by digging into it, and you could say things like, what were the stakes for this relationship? And you realize, wow, it's two families with, you might say, the sort of the prince and the princess of each family. This could have mended the feud. And you realize it doesn't mend the feud because of what happens. And then it lets us go even a little further, where you can see West Side Story, for example, and you say, well, West Side Story is not a retelling of Romeo and Juliet, it's a retelling of the myth. Here's the myth of this thing happening, and you go, wow, that's another way of telling the story. Two sides and all that kind of stuff. So what we do is, typically it happens a few different ways, but mostly three. One would be teachers get a subscription to come to as many Agora seminars as they would like. That's free to them.
We're talking about high school teachers.
Typically high school teachers, but we would take anybody who was interested. But the works that they're reading are probably not below junior high level, junior high or high school. But if a teacher from anybody wanted to come, we would say, come, we want you to be here. But what they will use in their classroom typically is high school or college. So the other is we get hired or we have a scholarship to go to a school. So we've done things where we train a whole school or a whole department. And then it gets really fascinating. So sometimes, and we encourage this, a school will say, well, we're going to put you in a room with, there's going to be English teachers who are totally into it, but there's math teachers, there's the PE teacher, and then there's the science teacher.
Okay.
And we say, great, we love it. And that kind of leads to another point, which is this learning and the teachers that teach at these colleges, they teach the entire curriculum. They don't just teach in what they got their master's or their PhD in. So we feel the same way too. We say with the right attention, anybody can read Darwin's Origin of Species. They can read, Middlemarch by George Eliot. You do not have to be an expert in that field, just with, enough diligence and thoughtfulness. So we've been in rooms in LA County or Ventura County with a whole bunch of different teachers, and we're reading Euclid's Elements, like Euclidean geometry.
Wow.
Yeah, it's totally great. But Euclid has, in the beginning there, are these common notions. And one of the common notion is a line has no breadth. So there's 2 points, a beginning and there's no width to a line.
Right.
Okay. And so you realize when the class starts talking about this, and these are all like, different age people, all teachers, the art teacher will say, every line has a breadth.
Right.
Like draw a line.
That
There's no way to
makes
draw a
sense.
line. Yeah,
That
totally
makes sense.
Of course it does. But then the science teacher saying, think of it ideally, like this is the ideal triangle.
Yes.
You're like, oh, okay. And then of course the literature teachers, this is what they do all day long, so they love all this stuff. But what's so great is that the art teacher gets to hear from the science teacher hears from the art teacher, and you realize we're all coming to this sort of learning together. Mm-hmm. So we find, especially with an active group, everybody benefits no matter what the work is, as long as it's great and it's worthy of conversation. And then they do that in their classroom. Those are the two main ways that we work with teachers. And the third is on our website. There's a curriculum map where you can go and listen to. We have hundreds of recordings of seminars. Mm-hmm. So if you were a teacher and you said, oh, I'm teaching Romeo and Juliet pretty soon, you could hear the Agora seminar, hear it going on, you get more confident. We suggest some opening questions. Mm-hmm. None of those are set in stone by any means. But here's some ideas. And then we also pair it with other work. So if you were to say something like, I'm really interested in virtue and vice, for example. Here's works that you could pair this with if you decided you wanted to read this as a class. And often the works are, if they're royalty free, we've got the texts online and you can download those. So teachers also use all the media that's on there and the curriculum maps that we have built for them. And that's all free and available.
It sounds to me like when we think about teaching, it's often top down. I'm transmitting information to you, but it sounds like this idea of teaching is more of a facilitation of a conversation.
That's it.
Without a set end goal necessarily.
That's it. And I think good teachers already do that.
Right.
There's a lot we don't know. Let's grapple with this thing together. And if we're being honest, I mean, that teacher, however seasoned they are, doesn't know what happens when you die, has problems in their relationships.
Totally. We're just humans.
We're only humans. So that makes it kind of real. Not like you're going to be having confession with your high school students, but more like saying, hey, yes, I have more experience than you, but there's things we're all grappling with.
Yeah, we're on a journey together.
We're on a journey together.
Yeah.
And those great authors do such a good job of bringing that out.
So moving on to a different topic, you mentioned Ojai Chautauqua briefly earlier. I'd love to learn more about that series and what it's evolved into.
No, perfect. So we were doing these panels first, and we've done 25 Chautauqua events altogether since 2014. So we started doing things like GMOs and fracking. We did water. Our first water one was in 2014. And for those of us who live in Ojai, this has been such an evolving conversation.
It really has.
Oh, it's just incredible. But every time we do one of these things, I realized I had no idea what the issue was or the issues were. So when I start digging in and doing this research, not just me, but me or people we hire or whatever, we start digging in and realizing, like how does the roadless diversion canal work? When do they get to open it? And
it's so incredibly complicated.
It is complicated, but it can be learned.
Yes.
And so what we That's an easy example.
Yes.
So when people are on Facebook and you realize, okay, it's starting to rain, and they start being really upset, and they say, why isn't the water going into the lake?
Yep.
There's a really good reason for that. Casitas doesn't own the dam. It's the Bureau of Reclamation. There's rules when the water can go in, and they can't even take the water right away because there's too much turbidity. So anyway, every time I do a subject, I realize, wow, I didn't really understand this very well. I understand it much better now. And so we met a guy. This was, we were doing things at the old Ojai Community Church there in Mirmani, and one of the facilitators, Dan Schnur, was so fantastic. It was on income inequality. And we said, Dan, we would love to hire you to be our facilitator for some of these things. Well, it turns out Dan was hugely connected, and he knew all these people in LA. So we started doing these things where we were bringing in all these LA reporters, like even people from Fox, LA Times. So it was media and politics, and very high end. The tough part was it cost a lot to bring those people here. And so we were kind of burning through all of our resources in that sense. The culminating thing for me was having Warren Olney, who I'm a big fan of. Dan interviewed Warren Olney at Matilaha, and it was great. So anyway, we had, then something happened for us, and it was in 2017, and we said, wow, tourism is such a gigantic issue right now, and had been. So we said, let's not use Dan, let's do our own research, let's get a local panel of people, let's talk about tourism. And we had the biggest crowd we ever had. I
remember that.
Yeah. And so we thought, okay, this we're onto something here, this local issue with local people, with a data packet that we're putting together. And I realized I didn't really understand the TOT or the OTID. I didn't understand the revenue, how much the city counted on it. I didn't really understand how the chamber was involved, the Chamber of Commerce was involved in promoting Ojai with the inn, et cetera, like went on and on.
Right.
And that was such a great issue too, because we had friends, we all have friends that had shops in Ojai whose friends were telling them, if you support more tourists, I don't want to be friends with you anymore, and the opposite. So we thought this is a place we can make a lot of headway. And then right after that, the Thomas Fire happened, and we had a very visceral example of, here's what it's like when there's no tourists.
Yes.
So we've got
here's
that.
Here's what it's like when there's no tourists, and also we need to come together.
Yes, and be resilient and get out of this problem. Good point. So so since then, primarily it's been local, and we've had local people. And when COVID happened, in fact, we were really becoming very focused on education. Ojai Unified School District especially, and we started centering around one of the things that we learned with tourism, but more in detail later, was this declining public school population since 2000.
Yeah.
So we thought, this is becoming more interesting as an aspect of Ojai life, where you see, here's a dwindling public school system. 2017 was that 7-Eleven committee possibly closing Miners Oaks, if you remember that. And so that was something we became really interested in. So we had a panel in 2018, I think, and it was addressing Ojai's declining public school enrollment. We had real estate, business, the mayor, Johnny at the time, and we started getting this much clearer picture of the way I thought about it from that event up to the present day was, there's the school performance, that is an issue and it needs to be addressed, not in every grade. There is affordable housing, there isn't enough. There is jobs, there's not enough high-paying jobs to get people to want to be here. And then something that's slightly more complicated and nuanced, but we're looking at the zoning of how we have mixed use here, and that contributes to the housing. So anyway, it just informed my thinking much more, and we started leaning more into schools. So when COVID happened, we thought, let's start having them online, like we're doing our seminars. So we did education after COVID. So we had Ojai Unified, Oak Grove, CSUN.
I'm sorry, I missed that one.
It's on the website. You can watch it anytime you want.
Great.
Yeah, and that's a big thing that we also wanted to do too, is say, hey, all of the steps are recorded, it's online, it's a public service. We're getting grant money for this, and it's something that we really care about.
Yeah.
And so anyway, we are about to launch in December an on-site panel on affordable housing in Ojai.
Good.
Yep, and this is very timely, but if you look at the Ojai Valley News that came out today, Kimberly Rivers did a summary of the October 4th Planning Commission presentation, which has, and you could watch the Planning Commission meeting yourself. So that to me is such a great example of the kind of facts we all need to have under our belt to say, here's what the state's requiring, here's what we're trying to do to meet it, here's where we're not meeting it, what's it gonna mean, so we can all go forward and have a sensible conversation.
Right.
What we've done since COVID is interviews, and so we've done 2 of the 5 city council people so far. Our hope is to do all of them, but we also switch gears a little bit to interview nonprofit people. So we've done the Land Conservancy. In 2 weeks, we'll be doing Help of Ojai and Ojai Unified School District.
Ooh.
Yep, so that'll be really good. So the idea then is we have a collection of videos that you can go back, similar to your articles actually about getting to know the candidates. You can at least hear them talk for an hour.
Yeah. Get to know the people
get to know them
in these articles.
Exactly. What's their vision for Ojai?
Yeah.
And we agree on the questions beforehand. We do that with all of our interviewees, and we try to have it be a conversation like we're having now, and they get full approval of the videos. They get full editing rights before it goes live. Mm-hmm. And so we hope that we're building a sensible forum where nobody has to be afraid of the Chautauqua or Agora saying, we've got a take, we're going to catch you at anything. Nope, just what's the facts?
Yes.
Or what's your opinion? And that's what we want to get at. So that's where the Chautauquas moved in. We deviated in 2 ways, and then that concludes that subject. One is we co-hosted the city council debates at Oak Grove School last year in October with the Ojai Valley News. And then we revived these brown bag lunches in Libby Park that the Ojai Valley News used to host.
I love those brown bag lunches.
And so we're doing those first Tuesday of the month. So again, lightly facilitated without an agenda, where people get to know each other and try to build trust. So
love.
I know, it's great. Now I have some future little ideas, like I have a hobby of buying URLs that I think about. So I have like literally 25 URLs that I haven't done anything with. But one is Ojai Knowledge, and something like Ojai Institute is another one. Mm-hmm. But one idea that I was thinking about for the Chautauqua, for Agora to pull off, and just in case anybody's confused, the Chautauqua is one of Agora's programs. It all falls under the Agora umbrella. But I thought, imagine if you said, hey, listen, I don't understand how the roadless diversion works. Mm-hmm. Oh, I know I could just go to Ojai Knowledge, and at least I can get linked to where I can get a description, or here's a video. Yeah. So then I thought, well, it'd be really cool if there was a neutral place that everybody knows they can go to, and if there is a take, then you've got 2 or 3 takes on it. So we would strive to have that be as, again, inclusive as possible, because there is a lot to fight about.
Absolutely.
But let's fight about what is worth fighting about.
Let's start from a place of shared facts.
That's it. And so I think that's where all of our city probably needs to go now, is to say, let's talk about what needs to be talked about, a vision for Ojai, but not what is a non-negotiable or is factually incorrect. Let's go with what's factually correct.
Well, it's kind of like how you discuss books. Yeah. Let's start from our understanding of the text, and let's not go out of there.
Good. No, exactly right. So at least you could say, let's use George Eliot as an example. So we're reading Middlemarch, and it's such a wonderful book. It's definitely in my top 10 now. But you see, she has this amazing narrative voice where it's really interesting, it's rare. She inserts herself as an omniscient narrator, sort of, but then she also says things like, well, I'm really sorry to say that so-and-so started crying. And you're like, wait, what is happening here? Like, what is she doing? Anyway, she makes also statements in general, like for most people, goodness is something that is invoked when it's convenient, but when it's inconvenient, you kind of, in a very tidy way, push it to the side.
Totally.
So we also keep it at fair game to say, do we think she's right about that?
Yeah.
Now, that's not a first question. That maybe is a question for the end. Is to say, does that resonate with our experience? Mm-hmm. And that's a good conversation to have. But there's nothing to hang that onto quite. So then that's a good ending question.
Yeah.
But when we read something like Hannah Arendt about, the book that we're going through right now is The Origins of Totalitarianism.
Topical.
Of course. Well, we have conservative people and liberal people in the room and everybody in between. And so what I don't want to do, none of us would want to do this, is we don't want to have a conversation about current politics that get people upset.
Yep.
But it's natural to say, oh, Hannah Arendt is speaking to things that you might be hearing now. And so then what we might do is to say, let's hold off on contemporary comparisons till the end, maybe with our last 15 minutes. But again, we still can work it in a way where, not where we're saying you liberals or you conservatives are wrong or bad or whatever. But we can have a conversation to say, something has changed in the sense that people who have opposing views are not just alternative views, they have become traitors. That's fair. And you can find lots of evidence there on both sides where you could say, let's use something very difficult like abortion, for example, and you could say, well, Ronald Reagan was a pro-abortion Republican when he was governor of California. What happened that now it's hard to be a Republican who is pro-choice now? And the Democrats have the same problem.
Yeah.
So, if you go against the party line, you're essentially kicked out of the party. It hasn't always been that way. So that's the kind of conversation we would get to now is, how did this happen this way? What are some things we can grab onto, and what might we do about it?
Yeah.
Even if it's just in our little valley.
Okay, so why don't you tell me what you value most that comes of the Agora seminars that you participate in?
Well, I'm a participant and a teacher, of course.
Yes.
So when I'm the teacher, and again, facilitator would be a better word, or tutor. I do get to see how people think, how they're formulating what they're doing. And it's so interesting because you get to see they might get the text completely wrong.
Yep.
That happens all the time. And also, some of the authors are pretty difficult to read. Like sometimes, let me use Aristotle as a really easy example. He'll say, so let's look at how people have thought about knowledge. And he'll give you a whole bunch of examples, like here's what Heraclitus thinks, and here's what Socrates thought, blah, blah, blah. And then you're reading that and you're going, yeah, okay, right, got it. And then he'll go on to say, of course, that's not the way it is. And then he'll say the way he thinks it is. Well, it's really easy to miss that line, to say, of course, that's not the way it is. And so people start arguing, well, no, he means this. And then anyway, so I get to see how people think, and it really helps me in my own thinking to say, how am I biased in some ways? And cognitive bias is such an interesting field and something that we're looking more carefully at. But how do we tend to believe things that confirm what we already believe? We tend to believe things that are recent, things like that. I love watching people, and I love watching people grow. So when someone first comes to Agora, usually they kind of struggle with the form a little bit. Then they get really good at it. And then they start, sometimes I hire them as leaders, years in, and I go, you're nailing it. You're doing so great. I would love to hire you to be a facilitator. This is an example, I didn't make this up. This is something that a lot of the schools use, this phrase, and Britannica uses this notion of the great conversation. And what they say is that this conversation has been happening for all cultures, for all time, and it's the conversation around these perennial questions. What's the best kind of society to have? And so people have been struggling with that question since there have been societies at all.
Yeah.
And they grapple with this, is a monarchy best? Oh, here's how it is best in the sense of you can get things done fast. It's not best when you have a tyrant. Here's how a democracy is best, et cetera, et cetera. So this conversation, these authors are talking to each other over millennia, over geography, and they address each other sometimes very specifically. They'll say, oh, like Descartes is addressing Aquinas and Aristotle very directly. Kant and people like Locke are addressing Descartes, and Newton is addressing Galileo, and so on, and Galileo is addressing Aristotle, and so on. And you realize, wow, I'm part of this conversation that they're happening, and I'm engaged in it, and I'm thinking, and I'm pressing myself. And so to me, I don't want to learn any other way. I love learning like this. And the camaraderie that happens in these rooms, people become lifelong friends because you're grappling with the most important stuff.
Yep.
And again, we talked about theology, but also things like mortality. So we're all wondering about that, where most of us have lost loved ones, but you're thinking about your own mortality. It's like, oh, how do you think about this? Or how do you think about, how would you come up with a way to be moral, especially in complicated situations? We're all with it. And most of us have done things that we regret. So you think, oh, how do people talk about how to be moral, or how do you deal with appetite and desire? Those are things we all have to grapple with. It just feels like a life's work. So I guess I value that the most. And here's Flannery O'Connor and her short stories. And you're saying, okay, my job is I'm at the feet of Flannery O'Connor, and I'm going to read her story to the best of my ability and try to understand where she's coming from. And it feels like you get to be friends with the best minds the world has produced.
Yep.
It feels great. So I guess I do love that about that. And I also think we're doing something that I hope we're fostering a way of being in community that it's more thoughtful than without it, and that's what I'm really striving towards. I mean, we all are in some very important, and you are in your own work. You're saying, let's come in a place where we're as authentic as we can be, as compassionate as we can be, but in a way that we're neighbors, we're here, we're in it together, we're like global neighbors, but we're local neighbors. But how can we come to some truth together and ways forward that are contributing to all of our flourishings?
Yeah. You mentioned something earlier about you felt like in these Agora facilitated conversations, people are learning how to read.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
I could tell you the very specific story. When I first started graduate school at St. John's, this was 1998, and we were reading King Lear in my literature course, and we were reading, that was next. We were reading the Canterbury Tales of Chaucer in the Middle English, so it was really fun to just get around that, get our head around that. It's kind of high Middle English, so it's not too bad. It's not like reading Shakespeare that you mostly can get, but if you start sounding it out, like you pronounce it, you start getting it. Anyway, in The Knight's Tale, there's this kind of story about why, part of The Knight's Tale is there's some background of the knight, and it explains kind of why he's doing what he's doing. And I said in the seminar, well, I think the knight's doing this for this reason. I can't remember what it was now. And somebody who was so gentle and so nice, who had been doing it a lot longer than me, they said, well, if you look at this page, and he read a couple lines, he says, you kind of see maybe this is the reason why. And he was completely right, and I was completely wrong. And in fact, it was like 180 wrong. And I realized, oh my gosh, I said, well, I kind of don't know what this word is, but I'll figure it out. Or I don't really know what is being said here, but I'll figure it out. And I realized I've been reading this way my whole life, where you're reading and you go, well, I don't know what this word means, but I'm not going to look it up or take the time to look it up. Or I'm reading a passage and I go, well, I'm sort of tired, I don't know what it means, but I'm sure I'll get it in context. I'll just speak for myself, but most Agora people don't let anything go by. And if you say, I don't know what this means, that's a great question for the group. You don't have to know what everything means. I don't know what everything means. But you read and go, what do you make of this? And you go, wait, what? Wow, what could this possibly mean? Especially, let me give you an example, since we're talking about Aristotle so much. Aristotle has this one text called On the Soul. And he says, if the eye were an animal, sight would be its soul.
Wow.
Okay, so think about that and you go, okay, if the eye were an animal. I love it when he says things like that, because you come to the group and you say, what do you make of that? So we're all sitting there grappling with it. What could he mean by that? After a lot of thought and a lot of conversation and more texts, then you can say, oh yeah, I think maybe I got a handle on what that might mean. But anyway, I was reading this, Chaucer, got it wrong. I came home, I called my wife and I said, oh my gosh, I do not know how to read. I said those literal words, and I realized I'm going to have to redo what I have done. And writing the same way. I was writing my papers for graduate school, and I said, well, the paper I was writing about was Plato's Republic. That was the book. And I said, in my paper, I said, well, these are the things that Plato seems to be really focusing on. And the teacher, he would read my paper and he said, what do you mean by these? And I realized, actually, I don't know what I meant. And I realized, oh, I'm using kind of stand-in language to kind of not know exactly what I mean. And then I would say in my papers early on, well, if a Freudian were reading this, they would say X, Y, and Z. Or if a Jungian were reading this, it would be X, Y, and Z. And the teacher said, let's just stick with what Plato is saying. And then I thought, whoa, I don't know how to write. And I've been writing for years. I mean, for work and blah, blah. But anyway, so then I thought, wow. And it just forced me to say, like, write clearly, know what I'm saying, don't say what I don't know, what good writers already do.
Very challenging.
Oh, no, it's hard, right? And then clarity, going for clarity and distinction. So in my reading now, I'm underlining parts. If I don't know what it is, I have a whole hierarchy, a system like a big question mark. I don't know what this means. This will be a great question. This jumps out as something very, very important, but in my notes, same way, and in my writing for it, same way. Like, you know, if I'm using a pronoun, be clear about what it's referring to. Try to trim, try to have short, clear sentences, things like that. And so not knowing how to read or learning how to read with Agora has been this gigantic blessing. And there's nothing special about me or anybody that comes to Agora. Anybody could do it. Yeah. It's just, that's what's kind of, it's like having a commitment to getting in shape.
Yeah.
You make a commitment with your trainer at the gym. And if you make an appointment and you say, oh, I have my appointment at the gym, it's Tuesday at 12 o'clock, it gets you to show up.
It's a practice.
It's a practice, yeah. So then you start, at first it's hard, then it gets easier, you build in enough time to do it, and you keep your appointment. So every Tuesday night at 5:30, we're reading Middlemarch, here's the reading selection for next coming Tuesday, and you read it. And so it's wonderful to have those kinds of commitments for books that, and again, it's all choice. Nobody has to do this. So you say, I want to read Middlemarch, or I want to read Brothers Karamazov, or I want to read Exodus, or whatever. And, you know, again, life gets in the way, and you don't have to go. And sometimes people say, oh my gosh, I'm sick, or whatever. Yeah. Of course, it's fine. But it's a nice way of learning, and you're committing to a group.
Yeah. So talk to me about how the reading and teaching you've done with the Agora Foundation, how that has deepened your understanding of, you know, the foundations of culture, of society, of government, etc.
Got it. Yeah. Here's somebody that I keep turning to. There's a couple people. One would be Martin Luther King and Jr., and the other would be Abraham Lincoln. So those two people in their writing, they're so clear that they first of all, just kind of rhetorically, they're making such clear points, and they have a method to what they're doing. But they reference the Bible, but they reference Western philosophy, and they'll make it really clear, like in Letter from Birmingham Jail that Martin Luther King writes. He says, a law that is just it's one that uplifts humanity, and it has to have some appeal to what he calls natural law. And that phrase, natural law, that comes from Aquinas and Aristotle, and many, many people write about what do we mean by a natural law, something that you actually have inside of you. And so to have somebody like Martin Luther King bring that up, and I've been the facilitator for that many times, and people, if they've never read it or they haven't read it for a long time, they kind of forget that. They forget that he's making that deep appeal. And so, and Abraham Lincoln, with his invocation so much of the Bible, he's making another appeal too, and he'll say things like, and he's not alone in this, if America fails, it's not just a shame for us, it's a shame for the whole world. So now that might sound sort of too centrist, you might say. Right. But I think they're making a kind of a case, which is America's trying something that's never been tried before. So to answer your question, like on the political front, the more that I read about in the Federalist Papers, we do the Constitution line by line, read the entire thing, and we are going through the Supreme Court cases and things like that. I realize there's so much good stuff here to learn from about our country. And also it makes it much clearer for me when I feel, or when other people are upset about something that America is doing, I can try to read let's use the Supreme Court as an example and say, let's look at this case that some people might be upset about, and we could read the case together and go around and say, well, what's being invoked? How is it being thought about? What precedents are they looking at? And then look at the case, and it's really fascinating. Like, there's conservatives and liberal in the room, and they could read like Roe versus Wade,
yep.
and then they could read Dobbs and Mississippi, and both sides will say, I kind of see what they're saying here, mm-hmm. because of the arguments of the case. Mm-hmm. And then you read the dissenting views, again, both sides, they say, wow, they're making an interesting point. And you also realize there's an argument from principle and an argument from consequence. Like, if this law happens this way, this will be a consequence if we do that. That's a very common way of arguing a case. Or it's irrespective of consequence. Here's the principle by which we are going to say X, Y, and Z. So what I would say is that, again, it's kind of like that tree, the roots underneath the grass. There's a lot happening underneath decisions that are handed to us, that we see, what happens in our political world. And having that longer view at mm-hmm. least gives you some idea to say, I'll use a really good on this front, because this is something people usually do ask me. They'll say, what are some of the things that you think the founders didn't envision that we're living with now? And I can say, well, I can give you some right away. One would be, they had no idea that there would only be two parties that would endure.
Yeah.
So they had much, and the writing's there. So they thought it would be more like a parliamentary kind of system that we see in places like England and Israel, where you have to come up with coalitions, mm-hmm. so that it forces compromise. Mm-hmm. So now with two parties only, essentially speaking, at least the ones that carry the majority,
right.
then you could say, well, there's people who vote just party line, our representatives and voters, who just say, well, I'm voting with my party no matter what it is. They didn't envision that. They didn't envision how much money would go into running for an office.
Yeah.
So if you think of like the writing about a congressperson, they would say, well, you've got your senators that have a longer view. They're supposed to be more stately. They're supposed to have the bigger picture in mind. And they right. generally do,
right.
for longer terms, and they have to be a little older. But then you go, the congressperson, every 2 years, they are so tapped into the people, mm-hmm. that bridge, those crops, mm-hmm. this port, whatever. And in fact, they say in the Federalist Papers, the Congress people have the most power. That's what it says there, because they're the ones most directed to the people. They're the ones withholding the purse, etc. So then when you see, well, how have things changed? That's what really helps you understand, here's the principle, here's how it's set up at the beginning, and you go, well, there's a sweet spot with number, and they write about that. They say, well, you want to have a group that is not so small, but also one that's not too big, that's right. unwieldy. So we've settled on our number in the Congress, but the number of people they're representing is so much larger. Mm-hmm. So you kind of go, well, are they attached? No. But then the money part, are they attached to who's funding their campaign? So that's something they didn't envision. And then finally, they did not envision the winner-take-all in all but 2 states for the Electoral College. So they thought, well, you have your electors coming in, it would be more like what we would call the popular vote. Mm-hmm. So at least what you could say is, well, how have things changed? Those are things that have changed. The Senate used to be chosen by state legislatures. That's changed. I mean, I don't have to do the history lesson, but you can see, oh, here's how things have evolved. And then, then you could look at the current state and say, how is it that we're in the situation we're in? Does the Electoral College make sense now? Does it not make sense? If not, why not? Do lifetime appointments for the Supreme Court make sense now? There's arguments why. Do they still make sense? Those are good questions. But armed with that history is really useful. Yeah. Then the thing that maybe there's just 2 areas. One would be in the sciences. There's so much like about in the past where people would try to say, well, what do we mean by cause and effect? And for the longest time, thousands of years really, they would say, well, if you really want to understand primarily how something is caused, you would understand the why of it. Like, why is it here? And so, like, if you said, let's say there's a statue right here, like a bronze statue, and you'd say, well, tell me what the cause of the statue is. And again, this is going back to Aristotle. You would say, well, there's what's called the efficient cause, meaning the sculptor, him or herself, literally sculpting it. That's the cause. That's a cause. The other cause is it's got the form of a statue versus a vase or a glass. It's got the formal cause. Then it's got the material cause, the bronze. It's made out of bronze or whatever. And then there's what's called the final cause. This is, again, Aristotle's scheme. The final cause is, well, the person who commissioned the sculpture in the first place is the final cause. It wouldn't come about had she not paid for it to be brought about. Okay, so what we have generally seen in the sciences is that the why question is one that we mostly can't answer.
Yeah. Especially
like in physics. So we've let go of the why, and we've kind of settled for that. And so, like if we were physicists in the room and somebody said, let's talk about quantum entanglement, and you'd say, okay. And if you said, how is it that matter does that, or why does it do that? They would say,
we have no idea.
That's it. They would say, well, we're not so concerned with why, we're concerned with that. Fine. And it's very useful. In fact, all the progress in the material world, you might say, has been that kind of cleaving of the why to the that. So we say, well, do we understand how it is that electrons or how particles can seem to appear kind of out of nowhere? No, but what we can do is funnel them in a line so that our computers work well.
Right.
So you're like, okay, so to understand that, like in the sciences now, is what we could say is, so the work has been in the material realm, not in kind of, you might say, the metaphysical realm or other realms. And then that's useful just to always keep in mind. And so even like the work in psychology or just physiology, and you can say, well, we've made tons of progress there, and we don't think that, somebody's poking a voodoo doll at you and that's why you're hurting. No, we're going to look at your back. Or whatever. But also, the holistic person would say, let's look at your lifestyle. Right. Let's look at your stress. Let's look at whatever. Look at you as a holy. So anyway, in the sciences, it's always good to kind of keep assumptions in mind. What's the kind of general scheme that's being brought to the table and things. And then just in literature, I would say, finally, to conclude your question, literature keeps breaking bounds, seems to me. And you might say the novel, whatever you want to say the first novel is, if that's Cervantes or whatever you want to say, but that way of looking at people, story does things that demonstration can't. And so you see, that's a way that the world keeps telling its story and keeps pushing. And so, like I mentioned Toni Morrison earlier, a book like Beloved, based on a true account, but there's a fictional story now, tells you what it's like better than the newspaper article. You could read the article for yourself about what happened. But then you read her account and you go, wow, I feel like I get it in a way that I did not get it. So, I mean, literature turns out to be as much truth, I would say, as science. So I think the rounded person reads all of the above,
Yeah.
So my answer is you come to it with a wave of background as much as you can get, so then it makes the current moment so much richer. Like it's kind of like knowing your etymology. So like a word like enthusiasm, for example, you hear the theo in that, and it's literally to be filled with a god. So
that's beautiful.
Yeah, one of my favorite words. So you say, oh yeah. So if you read like the Iliad and you go, so then Athena fills Achilles with rage. And you're like, that's enthusiasm. So you can become enthusiastic about Juliet or Romeo, or you can become enthusiastic about politics, but you're placing something as your sort of God at the moment, and you're kind of putting yourself aside. That's kind of the word ecstatic means, to stand beside yourself. Yeah. So that anybody who does any of that etymology knows, oh yeah, it's like this whole pyramid of meaning comes into your little utterance.
Unbelievable, the history that we're carrying around with us.
Yeah, so it's true in the way, like how culture works and all that. And then sorry, this is so interesting though, but just culture, like if you say, why do we have these very interesting traditions like Dia de los Muertos or things like that, where we honor the dead by literally feeding them? Turns out there's long traditions of that. There's long traditions of thinking that the dead are literally around, or marriage traditions that are so strange. Like, why do we carry people? I'm being traditional now, but why does the husband carry the wife over the threshold into the house?
Right.
It's to introduce her to the household gods that she is now going to belong to.
Whoa, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So you're like, whoa. And it's like, nobody thinks that's what it means now, of course, but then you're like, that's what it has meant. And you go, oh, there's all kinds of stuff that's happening for us now that we don't think about, and we don't have to think about it, but it's, there's thousands of years of practice.
Yes.
Just like your etymology that comes into the moment.
Yeah. Some may find going to a seminar about Aristotle or Plato or Freud or whoever to be intimidating. They can be difficult texts. Yeah. What would you say to them?
No, that's a really good question. It's something people usually do ask. I would say if you find, if you want to try it out and you're concerned, I would say start with something small, something short. And so Flannery O'Connor is a great example. The stories are pretty short. They're so good. They are among the best. And you see every word is just chosen perfectly. That's a great place to start. Kafka could be another example, a short Kafka story. Start there. And we offer those for that reason. That's a great way to sort of get into the mode of it. But then know, and this is true, every single person who has come, they'll say, you could do the Aristotle or the Plato or whatever, any of that really hard stuff, but if you sit with it and you don't let words pass by that you don't know, you look them up, you give yourself ample time, and you mark up your book or whatever you're reading on, and then if anything passes by and you don't get it, that's okay. It's great. That's why we do it together. We all don't get parts. So we're all influencing each other. So come with your questions and know, like, there's really no, well, first of all, there's no tests, there's no writing or anything like that. It's that we're trying to figure this out all together as, I don't know if I've ever been alive before, but we're all like newcomers.
Yes, learning for learning.
Yeah, and we're just trying to get this. And obviously some people have done it a lot longer and that will be useful. But there's no like grandstanding, and nobody really cares about being right. What they want to care about is furthering the conversation. So I want to say, don't be afraid, give it a try. And I start with something smaller just to get your feet wet, but then you could do all of it with just a little sufficient attention and just your interest. And it seems to me it's actually quite amazing, even people who would call themselves not well-read or not intellectual. There's tons of examples of these people that they just keep coming, and all of a sudden they're just like picking out the perennial question in it. They get it, and it's because you realize you're part of this big conversation. People are writing about all the same stuff. It's the same story that not the same story that keeps being told, but the same subjects keep being told about.
Yeah.
So, we see that. It just takes a little attention.
Let me ask you one more question before I get to my final question.
Okay.
So you've mentioned a number of times being comfortable with being wrong.
Yeah.
How do you create a space where people feel okay being wrong? That can be really difficult.
You're right. Well, I can give you the answer on both sides of either the recipient or the person committing the wrong.
Yeah.
Committing the wrong. One way is in your thinking and in your phrasing, in your language. You word it in a way, and you think about it in a way that you realize, I'm not committing to this thing. So, for example, if I was to say, when Aristotle says if the eye were an animal, sight would be its soul, it seems to me that he's saying something like, well, sight is the function of the eye, you might say, like the primary function of the eye. So it seems to me that soul must have something to do with function. So the way I just phrased that, I'm leaving a lot open. I'm saying it seems that way to me, and also by saying like primary function, I'm also opening up the possibility of other functions, other ways of what a soul might be. So part of it, and I'm saying that in a way that it gives you kind of an out, because if somebody says, well, have you thought about this? And you're like, oh, I didn't, but thank you. But actually, it's a way of framing thought. So then if it's like, oh, I'm opening up the possibility that I could be totally wrong about this. Now, as a person hearing it, if somebody is completely factually wrong, then what I would say is, Andra, like, help me understand what you're saying. And then you kind of try to make it more articulate. And then I say, well, how would you square that with this?
Right.
And then I would read this piece of text, I would point you to it, and then let you do it.
Yeah.
And then you kind of say, oh, you know what, I hadn't thought about it like that. And really, like, since there's really no grades, there's no right or wrong, there really is this kind of camaraderie, and we are all wrong sometimes.
Yes. But I find that people, just particularly in political conversation, have trouble acknowledging that we all make mistakes. We're all wrong sometimes. It's a hard place to be.
It is a hard place to be. So, I mean, now this is going to be so local, but our interim manager, Mark Scott, he's so great about this. He'll say, listen, I'm going to make a bunch of mistakes.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, what does that do right away? He's acknowledging, I don't know all this stuff.
Yes.
I'm acknowledging I'm new here. And it diffuses the situation.
It does.
It's like, you're like, oh.
It gives everyone permission to be wrong sometimes.
And it's not like comic relief, but it's just like, a deep breath out. Okay. I think that's golden, that kind of stuff. And so, for example, I mean, I think all of us can think of political leaders, nationally or otherwise, where you'd say, if you just apologized, that would actually take you probably 75% of the way.
Yep.
But you're not doing it.
I've made that recommendation.
Oh, yeah, so have I. I made it to lots of people.
Same.
I would say, even if you said, I apologize for the perceived impropriety, that would take you 50% of the way.
Yep.
And you're not even saying you did something wrong.
Right.
But no, it is hard. So then it seems to me like this is where, oh God, I'm so glad you're asking this question. To me, the smartest people that I've read or I've been in the presence of, they ask things, they'll say, I don't really understand this, but let's dig into this. Or if you're having a conversation with somebody and you use a word, here's like multiple PhD person, and he or she will say, oh, what's that word again? Or like, oh, what are you talking about? And you're like, oh, right, it's this weird little esoteric thing. And you're like, oh, thanks. So the people who kind of have the cred, they don't pretend to know everything.
Yeah.
So why do I have to pretend I can?
Right.
And or anybody. So to me, to be sort of like at the feet of Einstein, Newton, Jane Austen, pick your person, like Lao Tzu, for them to say, have a beginner's mind about these things, and you're going to stumble.
Yeah.
I take them as my guides, and so even if I were criticized for being wrong, I would say, well, I'm happy to be wrong, and I'm going to keep striving to be right, but I'm going to keep making mistakes. And if somebody, even now, let's go to the next level. If you're being criticized for something that you did wrong, I would say, this is a Stoic thing, I think it's Seneca says, well, yes, you're saying things about me that I'm not proud of, but if you knew me better, you would have more to say. In other words,
love that.
You're acknowledging you're not perfect.
Yes.
And you're striving to, well, hopefully, you're striving to be as good as you can. And that's what I'm going to say if anybody asks.
Lovely.
Your final question?
Well, I might have two. I can't decide. So obviously we're talking a lot about civil discourse. We're right here in Ojai. What can folks who are interested in kind of participating in a more civil discourse, perhaps with the Agora Foundation or outside, what would you recommend?
No, it's boy, I love this question. I would say that the people who disagree with you are not traitors. That would be the very first principle I would start with. That's the thing that seems to me essentially wrong in our country and in Ojai. So if we can really sit down and say, okay, I get it, you're my neighbor, we're in this together, we have differing opinions about whatever it is, let's come to it with goodwill first and primarily. So what that does mean, though, is that people on Facebook are terrible. Like, they're so awful. And Nextdoor, or pick your social media platform, where people say things they would never say to your face.
Yep.
And so, or they just somehow feel obliged, or entitled to criticize. So that's what I would suggest first off is let's set the stage so that we can actually just talk. That'd be the first thing. And then the next thing I would say is that's just, if we just did that, we would be so far ahead of where we are now.
Without it being a zero-sum game where if I'm right, you're wrong.
Right. That's how it is right now. That's how it seems to me, how it appears at city council meetings or how it appears on social media. Then the next thing I would say though is being as fact-based as we can, and that takes some filling in, it takes some attention requesting. Let me use an example. If someone says, here's this affordable housing project, and somebody else says, well, it's not an affordable housing project, then if you say, well, let's talk about what do we mean by those terms, one person is using the state strata of what affordable housing means, and the other person is making the case, I don't think that's good enough. I think it should be lower.
Right.
That's
valid.
Wonderful.
Yes. Yes.
That's the conversation. But if you say it's not an affordable housing project, period, the conversation, it's not open, it stops. Yeah. So then I would say let's be as fact-based as we can. And I would say cite sources. Yeah. So that social media is great for that, but in general, just say, oh, this is where I read this. Here's the website. You can go see it for yourself. If we could just do those two things, I think we would be so much farther than we are right now. Maybe just those would be great. Just those two things.
Facts, citing sources,
and civility.
And the
civility, though, I mean, everybody says that.
Yeah.
But it would be really practicing it in the sense of not insulting each other, being kind to each other, not making assumptions about other people's motives, but also. It means telling the truth. Civility means telling the truth. So it means not being disingenuous or derailing or providing ambiguity such that it skews an argument. That's almost like lying. That happens too. So I would say civility means honesty too.
Yeah. So I've asked you about your favorite books, but I want to ask you more specifically. Okay. This is a question that I've stolen from Ezra Klein. If you happen to listen to his podcast, what are 3 books that guide or inspire your thinking that you think others would get something from?
It would be so much easier if you said, what are your 10 top books?
Sorry.
I can narrow it down to like 5. But if I
fine.
Okay. Well, on the science side, there's a book, and not a commonly known person, but it's Hans Jonas, Jonas, and it's called The Phenomenon of Life. He's the person that I keep coming back to thinking, now, phenomenology is in a way, it's an anecdote or a response to the reductive minimalism of modern science. When I say modern, I don't just mean contemporary, I mean the Renaissance on, the Enlightenment on, maybe. So looking at something in a phenomenological way would be not just that you're going to dissect it and cut it into its parts, but what does it do in totality? So he does a really, really good job of looking at life, and I think he nails it. So I keep coming back to him about how to think about what life is, what living things are, organisms, what do they do? There's that. I mentioned it's Hero with 1,000 Faces. I just think that and Jung is attached to it, but Joseph Campbell, I think that kind of way of thinking about an evolution that you have, looking at your own dark side, looking at myth and archetype as a thing, culture is something I keep coming back to. Aristotle's ethics, finding a middle ground is so key, like in your own behavior. What is happiness? It's an activity. It's something that your soul does when it's being virtuous, is what he would say. That's been it keeps coming back to as a guide for me. Mary Oliver's poems about nature, I keep coming back to. So that's something it's just something that's always reflected for me, that she nails how I feel about nature, but also an emotional component about the preciousness and the ephemeral nature of life, I guess. But then finally, the Tao Te Ching, I read that almost every year. So it's that there is a way of things, and we're better off if we try to understand what that is and to go with it, That doesn't mean the easiest way. It means the way that is flowing, the way that it's presenting itself to you. And again, that's not the path of least resistance. It could be a hard one, like Rosa Parks. Now I'm completely speculating. Followed the Tao, but it was not the easiest thing to do. And so our job would be, what are you being called to do?
Yeah.
How does it work? Those places like in your own creativity where you find a flow, like it's like, wow, hours pass, you never realize it.
Yeah.
That to me is like you're in that mode. And that there's I call it there's a fertile void. So the nothingness that is the Tao has all these things that emerge out of it, everything that we see. And so it makes the world be a pretty magical place.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
That's such a good way to end.
Oh, great.
Ah!